have an event on from 2 o'clock till 6 o'clock called Diversity Extravaganza. And it is it's a huge event, and we've got musicians, performers, artists from Africa, from the Caribbean, from from South Asia. It really is we've got poets. It's actually superb event. And John Wire will be there representing Caribbean Finger Post, a new society based in Bangor. Right, now I did have an email from our first speaker saying that she was joining. I have sent her the link, so hopefully she will be joining soon. Now, Corinna, if she doesn't join now, what I will do is that we can always swap my talk for hers. I'll go first. I
No
just
problem.
sent her a message now because I don't want to keep people waiting.
Yeah, no problem.
Right, as it's turned 10, what would you like to do, Corinna?
Well, Zahara, I'll have to upload and get settled in, wouldn't
Yes.
she? So do you want to, should we do the introductions and kick off with you?
Yes, fine. Yes, absolutely.
Are you all right with that? Okay.
Yeah, so sorry for all of you who expected Zara to go first. I'm afraid you're going to have to put up with me. So now, well, diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am joinio ni heddiw ar digwyddiad hwn. Dwi'n siŵr bod y sesiwn yn mynd i bod yn diddorol iawn. Now, we are welcome to you all. We're going to have an amazing session this morning. It's going to be very interesting with a broad range of speakers. Now, my name is Marion Gwyn. I'm here today representing Race Council Cymru. Race Council Cymru is an umbrella body for over 150 grassroots organisations across North Wales. Well, sorry, across the whole of Wales. And now I am going to ask, because I've seen our lead for Black History in North Wales join us, so I would just like to, I'm sorry, Corinna, ask her if she'd like to say a few words. Now, before I do that, I would just like to go over a few domestics with you. After our first two speakers, we're going to have a short break just so you can stretch your legs. We'd be grateful if you could keep your mics on mute. We are being recorded, and so if you don't want to appear on screen, please mute. Please turn off your mics. And I'd like to thank Ethan Lloyd for managing our Zoom and recording for us today. We will be having at the end of the session a Q&A session, and so please put any questions you have in the chat box, and so we can all join in there. Now, I see our first speaker, Zara, has joined us. So before introducing Zara, I'd like to now introduce my co-host, because this is a partnership event with Dr. Corinna Patterson at Bangor University. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marianne, and Croeso Pawb. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the School of History, Law and Social Sciences, and it's such an honour to be partnered again with Race Council Cymru. We've done quite a few events now, Marion and I, and our danger is we get slightly overexcited about the next events that we could do, because it always inspires us even more. And I think that it's wonderful to be able to celebrate Black History Month in such an eclectic event, in a way, you know, gardens, environment, and racial identities, and the speakers and the range of sort of topics, I think, is quite interesting and exciting. So I'm a sociology lecturer at Bangor University with a particular interest in social inequalities. And I run a third year module on race, democracy and political ideology. And I'm also the diversity, inclusivity and equality officer for the school. So I'm working to try and embed inclusive and diverse curriculum within the school and also within the wider university, because we have a decolonizer curriculum kind of group and things like that. So yeah, so that's me. So wonderful. So Zara's going to start off as she has planned.
Yes.
Is that right? Or do
I think so. Now, I met Zara not so long ago, and it's as if I've known her for many years. She has impressed me so much. Zara Zaidi, she's a multi-talented political campaigner and lobbyist. She's the founder of We Too Built Britain. And do check the website out, please. We Too Built Britain, which campaigns to raise awareness of the achievements of underrepresented groups around the UK. Last year, she was behind the campaign to have a 50p coin minted, which recognised Britain's diverse past. She's currently negotiating with international agencies regarding Afghan refugees. And amongst the groups of the organisations that she has worked with in the past include the United Nations. And she's been recently working on something tirelessly. And it's something to me that has got to my heart. And I can't wait for her to discuss it with you today. So over to Zara. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Hello all. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. Sorry, my I hope you can see me all right. So I'm really honoured to be here. I did grow up in South Wales, Carmarthen, and until I was 16. So it was my formative childhood years, which probably accounts for why I'm talking today about what we have done in the media. If any of you have been watching some of the Welsh and national UK channels. So this week, the campaign group that I set up 4 years ago to try and promote more diversity and inclusion, called We Too Built Britain, and a historic rose breeder called Harkness Roses, we have launched what has been an absolute labour of love throughout the pandemic, and that is the John Asthymllyn rose. And I know that they're far better experts on gardening and inclusion in Wales than myself. So I will leave that to others to join in on the questions, and to, of course, in their talks to shed more light on some of the issues that I've raised. So why did we launch this rose? We wanted to do something about inclusion using gardening, using something that people don't normally think of. And we wanted to do something that touches people's hearts. And we needed to find a story that would resonate to touch people's hearts, but which would provide a link to talk about other issues, perhaps more difficult issues that people often struggle with, and what the sort of culture war of a diversity has shown us, which I find sometimes unhealthy, is that it detracts from doing anything positive to improve representation, because people are looking at the very polarized viewpoints and not the vast majority of people who could find common points to move forward together, and most of us would easily support. So the John Asthymllyn rose is launched as a symbol of friendship, love, kindness, and community. And it's about tolerance and inclusion, and to bring people together. Now, of course, you all know John Asthymllyn's story, an 18th century Welsh gardener, North Wales. But having grown up in Carmarthenshire and having known of his story as an ethnic minority young person or child at one point, it's a long time ago, so it's hard to imagine. His story stayed with me no matter where we moved as a family, no matter what I studied. I just remembered his story. And I felt, and I'll tell you why in a bit, but I really did feel, having done the We Too Built Britain campaigns around the first ethnic minority face on a banknote, the first statue, I don't know, in Scotland, that might be an ethnic minority person. It did strike me that all our nation's heroes need to be much more widely known. And actually, what our Hidden Hero Statues campaign does is we tell the communities, nominate people who they may not be famous, but they may have made an extraordinary difference to your community, and they might be cherished by you. So they are of importance to your community identity, and therefore they're part of our civic identity and our civic pride and our storytelling as a group of human beings who come together to share in this community. And I really do believe that all our nations' role models, um, meaning nations, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, deserve to be widely known, even in the corridors of power in Whitehall and Westminster. And so, why did I think Jonathan Symchlin's story resonates on so many levels? Well, it allows us to tackle different issues with a different level of seriousness, if you like, but it does provide that opening point to tackle um, his history, his origin story, and also the origin story of many who came to this country and Britain's past, but in a way that starts from a position of love. It starts from this positive campaign, positive feeling of, you know, John's story is known because it was cherished and passed down by his community. It's one of us. The issue, the question I pose back to people is, there were many like us. History was always inclusive. So let's tell all those stories, because yes, there's a lot of bad, but also there's a lot of joy and a lot of stories of where there was a lot of friendship along the way. So, as you all know, I mean, I'm not going to go into a story in great depth, but why does it matter in terms of this historic rose? He was an 18th century gardener who was the first well recorded black person in North Wales, and with his marriage to Margaret Griffith, part of the first interracial marriage in Wales, as far as we probably can determine. And as I said, after a traumatic start in life, being really torn away from Africa, torn from his mother, aged only 8. He was transported across the oceans and sent to the Wynn family in North Wales. And he found love and a life in Wales. And as I said, as I've said to a lot of media, is that this might be the first ever rose to be named after an ethnic minority Briton in history. And when we think roses have been around for not just centuries but thousands of years, that's quite that's quite something. And we felt that it was quite fitting that when you talk about expanding inclusion in gardening, when we're coming out of the pandemic, when gardening and nature meant so much to people, in fact, it was some of our only activity, it's quite fitting that it was named after a man who found solace in gardening. How did this rose come about? It really, as Marion Gwynn will tell you, a lot of our campaigns have literally been responses to um, some story where we felt we could make a difference. It's not, we're not set up as a charity, don't launch big competitions. It's not supported or funded by anybody. It literally is essentially a group of friends who thought that we could make a little difference in within areas of our control. So the rose came about after I was responding to a plethora of stories bemoaning the lack of diversity in gardening or countryside activities, and then some quite frankly ridiculous statements in social media on why ethnic minority people don't like nature or don't like gardening. And then, you're probably aware of some of the more sort of culture war scenarios around countryside pursuits. And I just felt that that was creating a bit of a paralysis in terms of the very many good activities going on. I mean, just looking at Bangor University's, calendar of events and panelists, there's plenty going on around inclusion. You don't even have to get into the politics of it. That is not to say you don't need to address the politics now, because there's a reason why these things are being talked about. There's a social justice element that needs to be put out there. So I really did not want to see gardening or countryside activities completely consumed by the same culture war that I was seeing over statues. And so I asked the editor of Horticulture Week, could I write a few stories about historic gardeners of ethnic minority background? Um, because it's that point of inclusive history and that line that people say, we have always been here. Or when you talk about making the point about inclusion, we are here because you went there. You went to where we were originally from, and we have become part of, at the time, we were part of the British Empire, or indeed with slavery or colonialism. There were other reasons why people ended up in these shores. And I'm not to say this, I have to be really clear here. Just because I am putting forward a positive campaign that focuses on a lens by which to talk about a multiple amount of stories or issues around Jonas Thumclin, that is not to say I'm making any viewpoint on the other campaigns that deal directly with the problem. It's just that I wanted an entry point, and it seemed to be a good extension to what we were doing around just inclusion on banknotes. Sorry, I moved my table, it's shaking the camera. So I felt that I could tackle the middle ground and tackle this as a societal problem that immediately, with your sort of headline on a mainstream newspaper, would not polarize, overwhelm, or confuse people. Because ultimately, if you're doing stories about diversity and inclusion, and as I said, there are many more experts on this call than I, but we're also living in very difficult times where people are struggling. The pandemic year has been hard. Well, it's been almost 2 years. It's been hard. I just felt that what people needed was more joy and kindness. Um, and so we really did see this rose as sort of a symbol of that friendship, um, to bring people together after the divisiveness of recent years. And, you just have to see the way our politics or social media has been transformed in recent years. There's a lot more tribalism in politics. There's a lot more toxicity, which sadly has been debated a lot this week in the House of Commons chamber. And, for the average Briton or Welsh person, you know, politics can therefore seem quite removed, or you don't know how to discuss, you just sort of switch off from it. Um, Certainly you don't think it's for you, but actually politics is the everyday. Politics are when your bins are taken. Politics is where your children go to school. Politics is how your neighborhood actually is run. Politics is about people. It's an organization of people. And we forget that actually power is about the grassroots, and not just about those in power. So who is Harkness Roses? Well, Harkness Roses is a rose breeder that's pretty historic. It's been making some of the finest roses in the country for 140 years. Two of its recent roses include the Queen Elizabeth II rose and the Duke of Edinburgh rose. And then you have Jonas Thumflin. So, and they really did use the same prestige quality for the rose as they had for the royal roses. And when I approached the managing director, David White, he was just so proud of doing this. They realized the historical significance, and they realized that they were doing it for the Welsh people. Um, and, you know, all I remember them saying is that they believe in the power of gardening to bring people together. They want to make it more inclusive. And it just felt for them such a joyous, positive campaign to do. And they want their roses to resonate across society and reflect society. And quite frankly, they were shocked that they had overlooked the fact that they hadn't been an ethnic minority Briton, um, at least in their catalogue. And they went through 140 years of catalogues of roses, and they felt that the same would apply to other rose breeders. Um, and so when they had a brief to design the rose, um, they wanted to first of all, do justice to the story of Jonas Thumclin. And secondly, they wanted to make sure, when you talk about inclusion, that anybody in the country could grow the rose, whether you have a garden, big or small, whether you're planting in a pot for your patio, for your balcony, for your roof terrace, or whether you're part of a community garden. And so they wanted it accessible, and Harkness roses prices tend to be in the more affordable range. But even then, they wanted it to be as accessible as they could. What is the Jonas Thumplin rose? And at the end, I'll show it to you. It's a hybrid tea sort of shrubby hybrid tea. It grows to about 80 centimeters tall and 60 centimeters wide. The flower itself is an absolutely beautiful yellow, golden yellow variety that doesn't fade at all. Um, and by the way, their roses are tested over sort of 9 years or so. So they really make sure that they know the qualities of that rose by the time it comes into production. Um, it starts flowering very early in the spring, and it goes on until the first frosts. So it's one of the longest lasting rose in terms of petals, and it doesn't fade. Um, and they chose yellow, and I'm going to give credit to Hannah Alban, who's the marketing director of Harkness Roses, who just had one call on what the rose could look like. She really felt that yellow had to be the color because it signifies friendship and warmth. And even if people don't grow a rose, you could gift a rose and brighten up someone's home. So it's all about accessibility, really, and making sure that as many people can not only have this beautiful rose, but have access to John's story. Um, there's a wider aspect too. Um, we wanted to remind people that of the joy that gardening has always brought to people from all backgrounds, and how the sector itself has benefited from the import of flora and fauna from all over the world. Um, Empire did bring um, um, it did bring a lot of benefits in terms of the horticulture sector, new varieties of species, and a lot more knowledge about different horticulture methods. And not only did we want to tell the stories of some of those individuals who are part of that, for example, Thomas Birch for Kew Gardens, but we also wanted to tell the story of horticulture itself in this more inclusive way. But we wanted to shift it to the emphasis on this positive conversation on what more can be done to increase access to a trade or hobby that so many of us clearly adore, and which is so good for our mental health and well-being. And I wanted to show that history itself can be learned is to be learned from. That inclusive history is not to be ignored. It can be a guardrail in our efforts to improve diversity in the present and to move forward together, because it is true now, it was true in the past, and it will be true in the future that we are far more connected than we think. But I want to give one caveat on the emphasis on always looking at connections, because I think some of the media ignore the sort of subtle message that we also give when we talk about our campaigns. We to Build Britain has campaigned to tell the stories of underrepresented groups or people in Britain, with the aim to build social connections and to show what we have in common. That is true. But why do we also do that? It's to then also understand and value our uniqueness and differences. Life would be boring if we were all the same. But the fact is, some of our differences can be impediments to just friendship, and also it can be impediments to social advancement and equality. And we still have that social justice angle. Um, so, the Jonathan McLean rose, it's doing a lot of work for a little yellow rose, but it seems to have been the perfect rose for what we were trying to achieve. And so what happened then was that the article that I did for Horticulture Week on Jonathan McLean created this groundswell of support for a new rose. I did a Royal Horticulture Society podcast. I did another one for the launch, but I did a podcast that people loved. And we just had lots of people talking about roses because it just touched people's hearts. And they wanted to know more. They probably wanted a respite from the statues culture war, but they really wanted to learn more about this beautiful story as well. So lockdown and the pandemic, and I think we mustn't never forget some of the lessons from this difficult year. This will be a theme in what I'm saying. I think we need to learn from the more traumatic past. We need to learn from difficult moments in life where we've shown resilience and where we've had to rely on other people. That is a bedrock of society. And through that, we value the enjoyable moments even more so. So lockdown and the pandemic really showed us the importance of community and the restorative power of nature. As I said, not only did we want the rose to be about friendship and connections, kindness, but the color itself was a symbol of human connections and friendship. And we really did hope that the rose can be the starting point. And Marian asked me what was the subject of my talk, and I wanted to talk about inclusive gardening, but also the importance of storytelling. We hope the rose can be the starting point for conversations between people to bring out more connections, and also to talk through our differences, our different backgrounds, our different origin stories, the different ways we view an issue. Nobody has to agree and be the same on everything, but I think we can all agree that we deserve that common respect and we have to listen. And through that, you can make those connections. And again, this little yellow rose, for me, can be the starting point of those discussions. When you are undertaking a project with the aim of connecting people, you might ask, why a rose? And it's not just because Jonathan Flynn was a gardener or a florist in the traditional sense of the word. It's because the rose is the ultimate connector. I don't know if in the audience or in the panel we have any experts on roses. I've got a few books behind me, but the rose really is the ultimate connector. It has deep resonance in British culture, but also in other cultures and across history. Whether it was, for the production of rose water in Iraq in 2000 BC, to the cultivation of roses. So roses for cultivating for gardening for the first time um, by the Chinese in 500 BC, to the Rosa alba that was introduced to the British by the Romans. Um, and that's considered, by the way, the white rose of York. So roses have been really around for centuries. And not only that, when you talk about connecting to the next generation, sometimes history alone doesn't do it. Popular culture does. And when you look at the rose, you just have to look at Shakespeare. Um, what's in a name? That which we call a rose. You can look at American Beauty. You could look at so many films and books where roses become quite seminal. Um, um, and probably my favorite quote comes from The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It is the time that you have wasted for your rose that makes your life so important. And for me, that captures the dedication that it takes to grow something, to plant something in the ground, to watch it grow, to take care for it. It requires patience, almost requires listening to the plant. It requires hard work. It requires creativity to think about where things grow in your garden. And often it requires, that sort of community to come together and to share in the joy of what you've done. And so um, we felt that, gardening can, of course, be more diverse. And we wanted to use those connections to the past to show how, look, everything you need to open up this sector is already there. And I think it would be for the better for it. Why? Because we've shown that diversity, inclusion, bringing things from other parts of the world, people from other parts of the world who've made the sector in Britain better, we've shown that it works. And imagine what it would do for our horticulture sector now if we really, really, with our hearts as well as our minds, focused on improving diversity and inclusion in gardening. And We hope that a rose by one of the finest rose breeders in the United Kingdom um, really shows the desire from the sector itself to improve representation. And as I said, lockdown really did show the importance of nature. And, we must never forget that every gardener will tell you that gardening is communal, it's restorative, it's creative. There's something magical about planting in the land. And when you look at, we're speaking to a lot of race equality experts. We're talking to a lot of people today who are experts in social cohesion. There's something magical about planting something in the land because it connects you to that land. You are part of the beauty of that land. And so I almost think it's a necessity to open up the countryside and gardening or the enjoyment of public spaces, public rural spaces to as many people as possible, because it is that connection to the land that is Wales, or the land that is the United Kingdom. And as the poet William Wordsworth said, nature never did betray the heart that loved her. A rose in the ground is never going to let you down. It's going to be yours. You did that. And when we think about the symbolism of what it means to be British, I mean, that's a funny phrase that you hear a lot, right? There are certain stereotypes, most of them quite valid. But we do seem to think that Britain is a nation of gardeners. So let's make it as open as possible, because it is so much of our national identity. You just have to open up some Hollywood movie and you see the rolling hills, the mountains. To many people, that is Britain, and we should be proud of it. But also, we should make sure that everybody can enjoy it. And by everybody, I don't just mean people of ethnic minority heritage. I think there's a lot to do around class, around. So I'll explain later. But part of what we're doing is to set aside 5,000 roses for community gardens. All they have to do is write into Harkness and say why inclusion in gardening matters, and agree to post a picture of their planting, so we can build up this community wall, community picture of joy and inclusion and celebration. But whilst not everyone can have a garden, you can have access to allotment, although it takes a long time on the waiting list, but you certainly can have more community gardening. And we need to make sure we make people aware of those possibilities. And so not only have we put aside 5,000 roses, but we're also talking to government about making this a scheme. And then, sorry,
I'm going to have to ask you to. We can carry on with this afterwards, so to wrap
sure.
up quickly, because I'll have to introduce Marianne and the rest of them afterwards. But
sure. So I mean, just to finish, we hope that representation, the message that the rose stands for, and the story of Jonas Stumpflin will attract people who never thought gardening might be for them. And we wanted to show that anybody could create a rose, could grow a rose. Yeah, let Jonas Stumpflin's story spread. And I just want to give this one quote from Mary Oliver's Blue Horses. Maybe our world will grow kinder eventually. Maybe the desire to make something beautiful is the peace of God that is inside each of us. We are all part of society. Thank you. And sorry for going on.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So much.
It was really nice. And I think my other career choice would have been gardener. So I think perhaps I need to buy that rose. Right, now we're going to thank you very much, Mr. Hare, for that. And we can carry on questions and answers at the end of the session, so you can inquire more and discuss further there. But we'll move on now, and I'm going to introduce my co-host, Dr. Marian Gwynn. So Marian is a historian who specialises in the history of Atlantic slavery and empire. She is head of the Heritage for Race Council Cymru, an umbrella organisation for over 150 minority groups across Wales. She worked for the National Trust for nearly 20 years, where she set up the first exhibition on any National Trust site on slavery, and this was at Penrhyn Castle. She was one of the contributing authors of a recent controversial report by the National Trust on slavery and empire. And last year, she sat on the Welsh Assembly Government's working group auditing the statutes and memorials of Wales connected to slavery and empire, and on the Welsh Government's working group on embedding the themes and experience of ethnic minorities into the new curriculum for schools of Wales. And I think that's coming out this year and next year, being released within the curriculum. So some really good sort of work there. And she's talking today on landscapes of Wales. So I'm looking forward to learn lots. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you. Right, now I was deeply touched by many of the things that Zara was talking about. There was so much about joy, how we can use bringing people together to challenge culture wars, the social justice angle, but also more importantly for me as a historian, learning from a traumatic past. And what I want to talk about today in relation to environment, racial inclusivity, is the way that our slaving past is reflected in the landscapes of Wales. Now, Zara spoke eloquently about John Stimslin's Rose, which I hope will leave a lasting legacy. Can you imagine bouquets of John Stimson roses being given to people? Roses, I noticed John Wyer's comment, being given to Liverpool and to Bristol and other slaving centres. Well, maybe after today we can think of a few more sites where we can donate a few John Stimson roses. Now, what I want to do, let's have a look first of all about Wales itself and how we in Wales like to see ourselves. I'm sure some of you here are familiar with Planet. Planet is a magazine dedicated to high quality publishing, writing and photography. It publishes articles from Wales about the world and about from the world about Wales. It publishes articles. It is basically the international voice of Wales, and it's one that's confident and one that places Wales very much at the heart of a global community. Its founder is a man called Ned Thomas. He was a lecturer, journalist, commentator, and he was very keen for Planet to promote Wales as he saw it, intellectually vibrant, culturally sophisticated, and confident in its history. And it seems very surprising to me, therefore, that when discussing colonialism, he wrote that no Welshman took part in the empire. Now, this to me is an absolutely bizarre thing to say. Did he not know he was highly educated? He was an internationalist. Well, yes, of course he knew. And I think it's of relevance to us today how he defends his statement, because he qualifies it by adding that when Welshmen, the term he uses, that when Welshmen were involved in the empire, they did so not as the people of Wales, but as Britishers. That is, they weren't Welsh when they did it. And he continues, the Welsh language was not a part of imperialism. Now, of course, Ned Thomas is not alone in this perspective, and we see it reflected in many of the discourses, public and academic, on Wales. And for every writer who has sought to explore Wales's role in empire, many others have ignored it or exonerated Wales' role in Atlantic slavery. And of course, Ned Thomas was writing this at a time when Welsh nationalism was finding a new force and direction. But this perspective does still endure in certain quarters. But how can, excuse me, but how can countries like Wales, and of course Wales is far from the only one doing this forgetting, how can we forget? And one of the reasons is because our sites of mass enslavement, unlike those in the US where they're surrounded by their former plantations, were thousands of miles away in the Caribbean and at other places around the world. But I argue that we in Wales do have a landscape steeped in slavery, as long as we know where to look and what we look for. And so when I talk about a slave landscape, what I'm actually talking about is a landscape that has been impacted on in some way by connections to Atlantic slavery. Now, up until relatively recently, modern historians exploring this story have centered on slave ownership, and perhaps rightly so, as this is the most, I think, charged with emotion and human tragedy, as covering as it does Britain's involvement in the actual enslavement of other human beings. And the form of slavery that Britain adopted, chattel slavery, was one of the most brutal forms of enslavement, with an appallingly high death rate. And within this, we have no problem looking at some of the big guns of Welsh slave ownership, like the Pennants, formerly of Penrhyn Castle, that we see here. But they were far from the biggest slave owners, and there were plenty more, even in Wales, who made far more money from slavery than they did. But while looking at this slavery, at this aspect, slave ownership is crucial. We have got to put it into context. And to understand Wales's role in Atlantic slavery, we need to probe deeper into what this actually means. And when we look at slave ownership, look at Atlantic slavery, what we're actually talking about is the shipping of goods and humans around the Atlantic. And this was an enormous commercial and financial network of relationships that was so lucrative that those at the top of the system kept it going for almost 400 years. Now, just look at all of these now. There's no primacy. You take even one of those away, and the entire slaving system just collapses. You cannot do it. Without the slave traders, you do not get the people who owned the enslaved. Without the ship owners, you cannot transport them across the Atlantic. Without the manufacturing, the resources, the supplies, you have no goods to exchange with the African slave traders for captive Africans. Without the pirates in the early stages who kept those shipping lanes clear. And insurances, these slaving voyages were hugely expensive, and so you needed to insure them. And without a navy and military guard, then that insurance was null and void. So every single part of these kept the entire process of the slave trade going. And at the top of it were people raking it in, irrespective of what the human cost was. And there are several examples of each one of these across Wales. Now, what I've started to do in my research, whenever I find a connection, I just drop a little point on a map. And it's really interesting when I was looking at Wrexham, because all of a sudden, all these little dots suddenly started appearing. Bup, 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 bup. And it's very interesting that when we look at Wrexham, and this can be replicated elsewhere, each one of those connections is different. Some of them, whether it's investing, inheritance, marriage, industry, manufacturing, heavy metal work, and land ownership. Now, land ownership is very, very important regarding slaving money. And Wales was a particular draw for such wealth, because if we look along the North Wales coast and the South Wales coast, you find that rich merchants and bankers who'd made their wealth in Bristol and Liverpool are investing in landed estates along those areas. And of course, if they're buying landed estates, they're employing hundreds of people. They have tenant farmers, tenant workers. And so you find that the impact of slaving wealth is spreading not only through the industrial centres, but also very much at the heart of rural Wales as well. One of these is Havadinnos, which is, as you can see on the little map here. I'm putting a map on every page so you can see where these sites are down the Conwy Valley. And Havadinnos was owned by Samuel Sandbach. Samuel Sandbach was an owner of enslaved people. He was a Liverpool merchant. He was a plantation owner. He traded in coffee, sugar, molasses, and rum. And he became Lord Mayor of London. I'm just going to quickly flick through a few of these examples. Moving down now to Pembrokeshire, we're going to look at Ffynnon. Now, Ffynnon is very interesting because this has naval connections. This was owned by Stephen Colby. Stephen was the youngest son of John Colby. His older brother had inherited the family estate, leaving him with very little opportunity to make money. So he joined the Navy and took part in the Atlantic convoying, ensuring that the slaving ships sailed safely across the Atlantic. He became so wealthy from this that he was able to come back to Wales and buy 2 landed estates abutting his brother's estate. And so he became far wealthier than his brother did from the normal inheritance of a landed estate. And so you can see how different aspects of involvement in slavery is having direct impact upon the landscape of Wales. Now, the Morgans of Tredegar House is particularly interesting because they always denied any connections to slavery, referring only to their distant family member, Captain Henry Morgan, of course, the notorious pirate. But the records show very clearly that the Morgans were the founding members of the Royal African Company, which held for a while the monopoly for the trading in enslaved people in Africa. And another interesting one, again down in South Wales, in Monmouth, is Piercefield here, which was owned consecutively by two owners of enslaved people. The first is this guy here. This is Valentine Morris. He owned plantations in Antigua in the Caribbean. After him, it was bought by a man called Nathaniel Wells. Nathaniel Wells is very interesting for many reasons, not least because he was black. His father was William Wells, a white plantation owner, and his mother was Juggy, one of his enslaved workers. Now, it is clear that William Wells adored his son. He adopted him as his heir. He brought him to Britain where he was educated. One thing he did not do was free Nathaniel's mother, Juggy. It was only on his death, when he left his entire estate to Nathaniel, that Nathaniel actually freed Juggy. Now, this did not make Nathaniel a better slave owner just because he was black and himself born into slavery, because we know that cruelty, death, illnesses were as high on Nathaniel's plantations as they were on everybody else's. And he himself received compensation on the abolition of slavery from the British government. Nothing, of course, going to his former enslaved workers. But it only goes to show the power of money that colour meant nothing, because he was able to reach the highest levels of British society. And he became Britain's first black high sheriff. And this guy here is particularly interesting. This is Sir Thomas Middleton of Chirk Castle. Normally, the history of Chirk Castle is told through the story of the Civil War. It's owned by the National Trust now, of course. But what we have with Thomas Middleton, he was a very successful merchant, making his money not in Bristol or in Liverpool, but in London. And he invested some of his slaving wealth here at Chirk Castle. And what we have here is one of the earliest examples of Britain's involvement in Atlantic slavery, because he was in it from the very beginning. And indeed, he was one of its major funders. And practically nothing is told about this man's story. We don't have time to do his colonial connections justice, but here's just a quick list. He was one of London's biggest sugar merchants, owning one of the largest sugar houses in the country, importing slave-produced sugar from the New World. He was a tobacco importer. He was a founder member of the East India Company in 1599. He traded with Portugal and Spain as part of their Atlantic trading routes, even when it was illegal for him to do so. And he funded several buccaneering expeditions, including those of Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir John Hawkins, modern Britain's first slave trader. He was also responsible on behalf of the Crown for the valuation of prize cargoes from enemy shipping, enabling him to, as some accounts say, furnish Chirk Castle with luxurious fabrics and artifacts. And he was so rich that he became one of the biggest money lenders in the country. He lent money to the king, to businesses, landed estates, to enterprises. He part-funded some of the early settlements in North America, and was one of the founders of the Virginia Company. The Chirk papers are held in National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, and included in the records are details of one ship that he funded. There's several records there. But this one ship was taken, it was an enemy vessel, as was typical of the time. They dumped the cargo of enslaved Africans on some island in the Atlantic without checking if there were enough provisions to care for them, bringing back to the UK only the saleable commodities of sugar, spices, and silks. But you don't need to go to National Library for evidence of empire with Sir Thomas Middleton. It's everywhere you look at Chirk Castle, with, for example, plasterwork like this, where you have evidence of his interests in the East India Company and evidence of his trading in the New World, and other items perhaps more startling like this. This figure, the blackamoor, I apologize for the bad photograph, but this figure is actually it's 4 feet high, and it was one of the newel posts to the grand staircase at Chirk Castle. They also have at Chirk not one but two slave bracelets. And I think it is about time that perhaps they sought to interpret these objects at Chirk Castle. But let's look at Welsh iron now, our natural resources, which were used in huge amounts to support the slavery, to support slaving interests. Welsh iron was used for ordnance, for the cannon, for the muskets, for the pistols, for the cannonballs that supported slavery and the East India Company and colonial expansion. Not only that, but it supported other slave-related items like voyage iron to be exchanged for Africans on the west coast of Africa, machinery, the cane crushers that we see here for the plantations, and shackles and machetes. They were all made from Welsh iron. Now, iron was mined in several places around Wales, but when we talk about supplying the slave trade, two areas dominate. The first and the biggest was Cyfarthfa Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil, and were set up by this man here, Anthony Bacon. Any heavy industry demands huge amounts of capital to set it up, and he had it in abundance. He'd made his money as a shipper in tobacco. He owned at least 6 slaving ships, and this gave him enormous wealth. And he invested it into Cyfarthfa. He had government contracts to the tune of what we would call now over £6 million. He supplied the cannon not only for the government, supplied the Navy and the military, but also he had the monopoly for supplying cannon to the East India Company. And of course, Cyfarthfa went on to be the largest employer. It brought people in, it increased settlement, and there was accompanying growth in trade, accompanying trade to accompany it. So massive impact on the area. And also in North Wales by Wrexham, we have Bersham Ironworks here, run by this man here. This is John Wilkinson. He was known as Iron Mad Jack. He was obsessed with anything to do with iron, and he devised a way of boring out cannon from a single piece of iron. Previously, they'd been molded in 2 halves, stuck together, and frequently they would blow apart when they were ignited, of course, killing the wrong side. And so his innovation of boring out from single iron made cannon a lot safer for those using them. And we know from the records of Bersham by Wrexham that they actually made at Wrexham the cane crushers that were sent, excuse me, to the Caribbean, used by enslaved workers to crush cane. And then moving on to Welsh copper. This is a massive story, and it involves the whole of Wales. Copper was used in many parts throughout the entire Atlantic system. It was used to clothe the ships, the hulls of ships. It made them faster, protected them from the teredo worm, which bore into the sides of ships. Manillas, these look like slave bracelets, but they're not. Millions of these were made not only in Wales, but throughout Britain, to be taken down to Africa as currency. Copper bowls, which were used to clarify the sugar, and copper items to manage the production of sugar, and also these items here, which were used for exchange with the African chiefs. And there wasn't a single part of ours, I don't think, that was involved in this. It was mined here at Paris Mountain, here at the top of Anglesey, and it was smelted here at Greenfield, which we see there in Flintshire, and also a massive copper works down in Swansea. And it was all managed by this man here, Thomas Williams. He was called Twm Chwara Teg, Tom Fair Play. The last thing he was fair, because the people say what a hard-nosed businessman he is. When he fought against the ending of slavery vociferously because he made so much money from it. When he died, it was said to be that he was the richest man in Wales. His partners in this included the Baileys, who later went on to become the Marquesses of Anglesey, and here is their home at Plas Newydd here. His other partner, this top there, was a man called Edward Hughes. He was known before he got involved in the copper industry as a humble curate, and his son went on to become Lord Dinorban, and this is his home at Kinmel Bay by Prestatyn. They were just made huge amounts of money from their involvement in the slave trade, and it covered North and South Wales. Welsh lead that hasn't really been looked at. Millions of gallons of lead went into paint that painted all the Atlantic ships, painted the ships for the East India Company, and also they were taken to the shot towers in Bristol and in Liverpool, and the shot was used for all the Welsh iron weaponry that we've seen before. And what about the church? The church provided moral guidance for slavery, and indeed many members of the church were direct slave owners themselves. And I just want to have a look at a few examples now. This is St. Mary's Church in Welshpool, and we see here a golden goblet. This goblet is actually solid gold. It is one of the very few solid gold goblets we have in the entire country. Most goblets are just gold plated. This was donated to St. Mary's by Thomas Davis. He was a member of the East India Company, the Royal African Company, and he was also a plantation owner in Barbados. And it actually says very clearly on the goblet where this comes from. It's actually made of Guinea gold from what is now Ghana. And this cup was used to deliver the Eucharist. It was the communion cup in Welshpool. And of course, the Eucharist cup symbolizes the blood of Christ. And yet that cup was bought with the blood of human beings. And we have here St. Giles Church in Wrexham. And there's the tomb of Elihu Yale, an incredibly wealthy man who was the chief agent for the East India Company in what was Madras in India. He became hugely wealthy, bought paintings, invested in landed estates, and of course it was his wealth that helped set up Yale University in America. He endowed St. Giles in Wrexham with an extra wing, with pews, with paintings, several items. And sorry, I know I'm running out of time. I shall move very quickly. And so we have Yale here in the centre making all sorts of marriage arrangements for his children. This painting was recently brought down in Yale on the request of the students, because what we see in the painting is that we see a little boy there with a collar and a padlock on. And we perhaps need to think of the various things that we have around Wales in different areas. Now, I'm just very, very quickly just going to look, there's no time, at Welsh wool, but Welsh wool was something that covered the humblest of people. It didn't have a rich man at the top making the money, but was made by what is considered humble, poor people who sold their cloth that was used for clothing the enslaved. It was actually used and recognized as a cloth. We see these now where for runaway slaves, we have adverts where the runaways are described as wearing a Welsh cotton jacket. That's not cotton as in the cloth, but cotton as in a raised surface. And Richard Hassell, a merchant who was on the west coast of Africa, wrote in 1682, I do believe that Welsh plains would sell well here. The African traders really liked them. Gave me a cloth of Welsh plains, which is very handsome. Carolina, the plantations there, the state itself named Welsh plains, this very specific cloth, as being the ideal cloth for clothing enslaved workers. So it was recognized, and miles, hundreds of miles of cloth was woven on very simple looms like this, cottage looms. There wasn't a single farm in mid Wales that didn't have a loom. A lot of money went into these areas because of this. And one historian wrote that Dolgellau, which is the market town for mid Wales, appeared almost by stealth, but we know it didn't develop by stealth. It grew because it had money from Liverpool and money from slavery. Did people know at the time? Yes, they did. And you have people like Thomas Pennant, a very famous travel writer, saying, covering the poor Negroes of the West Indies. Other writers are saying very clearly that it's going to the West Indies. Now, looking at these images here, how do we record our connections to slavery? We know it's controversial, we know it's difficult, but in a country where we must be honest about our past. And with the new curriculum now, Wales is actually making huge progress. As we've heard, there's so many community events that are going on that are tackling this subject. Now, with the new curriculum, I have heard time and again teachers saying, but there's no connection to Black history in my area. Well, I think from just this short presentation we've seen, it's very hard to find a part of Wales that wasn't connected in some way to Atlantic slavery. Now, tourists and locals alike flock to areas like this here. They're beautiful and soothing to the spirit, but each one of these images here is directly on one of the sites that I've discussed today in this paper, but you wouldn't know it. Now, we've no idea where Wales is going over the next few years or what sort of country it will be, but whatever form it takes, for us to have a robust future, we must understand our past. Thank you.
Marianne, I just want to chip in before you take on afterwards. That was excellent, and I think we could all keep on learning so much of the history we know nothing about. It was really, really fascinating, and yeah, I'll just carry on plugging your knowledge as we as we go along. Okay, thank you.
And now we're going to have a quick 5-minute break. So if we could all be back by, say, 10 past, and we'll start off then at 10 past. Thank you very much indeed.
Nathan Abrams. And in addition to being the professor of film, Nathan Abrams is the director of impact and engagement at the College of Arts, Humanities and Business at Bangor University. He is also the lead director for the Centre of Film, Television and Screen Studies and co-convene the British Jewish Contemporary Culture Network. He lectures, writes and broadcasts widely in English and Welsh on British and American popular culture, history, film and intellectual culture. He co-founded Jewish Film and New Media, an international journal, and his most recent books are The Bloomsbury Companion to Stanley Kubrick with I.Q. Hunter, Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick and the Making of His Final Film with Robert Kolker, Stanley Kubrick, New York Jewish Intellectual, Hidden in Plain Sight, Jews and Jewishness in British Film, Television and Popular Culture, and The New Jew in Film, Exploring Jewishness and Judaism in Contemporary Cinema. He is currently working on a biography of Stanley Kubrick, and I'm still traumatized from watching Clockwork Orange in my undergrad years. So yes, fabulous. I think he's a positive expert in Stanley Kubrick, but today he's going to be speaking on the unnatural Jews and nature. Take it away, Nathan.
Thank you, Karina. You can all see the PowerPoint, right? And
We can.
yeah, it doesn't
All
matter
good.
if you can see me. You're not missing anything there. I always forget that if people are going to read these out, that I would just write something much shorter, like Nathan. Nathan dabbles in gardening and fails would have been my intro. Would have saved valuable minutes there. But diolch, Karina, and diolch, Marian. Thanks for having me today. And so I just thought I would make a couple of observations based on what I've just heard in the order that I heard them. So during the first talk, I thought, oh, I wonder what the Jewish connections are, and straight away I came up with this quote from Song of Songs, and I just wanted to add that Hebrew has not one but two words for rose, Vered, which is the more classical Hebrew, and then Shoshana, which is modern Hebrew. But it's also my mother's name, who's here today. And I Googled that, and my mother's name, Rosalind, means beautiful rose. So that one's for you there, Mum. Hopefully I get extra brownie points for pointing that out. And also Jews use a lot of rose water in their cooking. So I thought I'd make that connection. Obviously, making connections to Marianne's talk is extremely problematic, and I am interested in the Jewish history of North Wales, and no doubt that Jews served in the auxiliary industries to the ones that Marianne mentioned, but this all needs further fleshing out. So anyway, just a couple of connections to the previous talks. I won't read this out. This is just the abstract. But what I will do is I'll try and sort of just talk this informally, and if I have time, hopefully, Karina, you can give me a signal. So you can be as rude as you want to tell me to shut up. I'm used to it. And so I'll just talk a little bit more informally about the stereotypes and how they've played out in Jewish film and visual, well, not just Jewish film, but in film and visual culture in particular. Right, so the first thing I did, as you can see, as I was creating my PowerPoint, I thought just to begin this talk, I would use the PowerPoint image search to see if I can come up with some relevant images, and this is what PowerPoint uses to search the web, and this is what it came up with. I thought this is very interesting, because if I was to look at this and think, well, what stereotypes do I see of Jews here in the connection with nature? Well, what we get is ancient. This one in the middle on the top row is kind of ancient biblical Israel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. This one here isn't even Jewish. It's the Baha'i Gardens in Haifa, very beautiful, in Israel, but not Jewish. That's the same as here. A cemetery here, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I think this is a wedding. So it's like a wedding arrangement. So you think, well, straight away, what kinds of stereotypes are associated with Jews and nature? But you can see death, marriage, not even Jewish, ultra-Orthodox Jews. very limited range. So in a sense, I'm just using this as a little indicative kind of illustration of the fact that Jews are not automatically connected with nature, either by Jews themselves or non-Jews. And I just want to talk a little historically about that. So from the non-Jewish perspective, the diaspora Jews in particular have been sort of classed as unhealthy, and physically unhealthy, as well as unhealthy in every other sense. Hence anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism over the years. In the medieval period, for example, Jews were suggested to have close links with the devil and his cloven hooves, but also that Jews had feet deformity. There's a very interesting book called The Jew's Body by Sander Gilman, where he talks about all the different parts of the Jewish body and how they've been stigmatized by non-Jews. And but as we got into the early 19th, into the later 19th and early 20th centuries, this rendered Jews unfit for service as foot soldiers in the infantry of the armies of the newly established nation states, because they were meant. Sorry, I should have explained. Because of this cloven hoof that's attached to Jewishness, Jews were meant to have foot deformities. So the point is that the Jewish body is rendered unnatural and therefore doesn't belong in nature. There's something unnatural about the Jewish body. It's unwholesome and it doesn't belong in nature. And it's overwhelmingly, as we get into the 20th century, connected with the urban rather than the rural. This isn't helped by a kind of parallel Jewish self-conception that's sort of both reacted to its history, but also internalized some of this. So just to give a very potted history, if you think once the Romans expelled the Hebrews from ancient Israel, what was a religion very much based in nature and the soil. I mean, obviously a land-based religion in Israel and around the temple and the three what they call foot festivals, ironically enough, where Jews were encouraged to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem to sacrifice animals. There was very much a connection between nature, harvest, the bounty, and the land of Israel. I mean, Judaism has a New Year for trees. So trees get their own New Year, which is probably something we should all do in this era. But obviously, once Jews are expelled from the land of Israel and the temple's destroyed, that connection between place-based religion and nature is destroyed. I mean, and is reconceptualized as prayer and service, especially sacrifice. So daily prayers replace the sacrifices as the study. I should not service. Study is what replaces sacrifice. And Judaism becomes very much a religion of study and of prayer and of good deeds, and the whilst that connection to nature is maintained, it's more in a kind of spiritual sense and a metaphorical sense rather than the actual sense. And this is exacerbated through the diaspora until 1948, as Jews don't have their own land to base this sort of nature-based religion around. So a lot of it gets channeled into a yearning for the land of Israel, the promised land, as opposed to actual sort of nature-based activity. And this is exacerbated in the diaspora as Jews are denied opportunities because of anti-Judaism to participate in the kind of more in things like riding horses, owning land. Owning land is not a good thing to do if you're constantly expelled. So if you look at the expulsions across Europe in the 13th century, the one from, well, initially Wales and then England in 1290, having land is not a good idea because you can't take it with you. Probably can't sell it quickly enough either. So that connection between Jews and the land that was very strong in the biblical era is kind of deracinated by the modern period. And what we see is this is internalized in this Jewish self-conception. So I've said this already, privileging of study over nature. And we produce these two kind of, this is the binary opposition I like to use, is a Menschlichkeit versus Goyimnachis. I'll just explain those. Menschlichkeit, it comes from the German term Mensch for man, but it means a kind of fine, upstanding, ethical human being, who looks out for others. And then this is contrasted with goyim nachis, which is pleasures for the non-Jews. Goyim literally means nations in the Bible, but is also etymologically related to the word gvia, which means body in Hebrew. So what we could suggest is that the Jewish self-conception, particularly Ashkenazi self-conception, is over ethics and morality and study, rather than physicality, rather than in the medieval period, think of things like jousting or horse riding, or courtly acts of love. These were things that were disparaged by Jews. Well, they weren't allowed to do anyway, but disparaged as being what they do, and what we do is study, and is much more ethical. So what we have is a culture of both anti-Jewish stereotypes, which are internalized but also reacted to, with a Jewish self-conception that maintains that this Jewish link between Jews and nature somehow doesn't exist. Obviously, if one was to take this into the modern period in the 20th century, with the immigration, colonization of what was then the Ottoman Empire, and then latterly the Palestine Mandate under the British, there's a lot of reaction to that, but that's a whole different talk about how the Zionists reacted to that by creating a different self-conception. But what I wanted to do was to now just sort of think a little bit about how this plays out in modern Jewish culture, and how this is reflected in just lots of our popular culture, largely created by Jews actually, but probably as those images that I showed you earlier from Bing in non-Jewish culture. So Howard Jacobson, who's been described as the Jewish Jane Austen, and let you make of that of what you will, is probably one of the most famous Jewish novelists of the contemporary period. I love this quote. I'm going to read it out just because I like it so much. I know you can read it, but in the highly improbable event of his being asked to nominate the one most un-Jewish thing he could think of, Sefton Goldberg would have been hard-pressed to decide between nature, love the use of the capital N there, that's to say birds, trees, flowers and country walks, and football. That's to say beer, bikes, mud and physical pain, right? So I quite like football. I do enjoy nature. It's hard not to when you live up here. But you can see those stereotypes deployed by a Jewish author there, right at the outset of this book. For those of you in academia, I recommend this book. It's about a lecturer and his office mate who's never there, but somehow leaves millions of notes and organizes his essays and puts a different coat on the back of the chair every day, but never sees him. So here's an example of how Jacobson internalizing and then thus reinforcing these stereotypes. And we see this a lot through films. I won't have time, but we could share the PowerPoint and you can look at the clips. But we see this, I'll just focus on this one, but the ones I was going to talk about, the City Slickers, Rio, Rio, I don't know. This is the problem with this. I see it's gone onto YouTube. And I don't know how to get it back off there. But I'll talk about the first one. I suppose the best thing is to go back to my PowerPoint. There we are. Right. Oh. I should have warned you. That's the nature in my house is going to protest what I'm saying, because someone's probably walked past. I'll focus on this one for the final. How long have I got left, Karina? 5 minutes?
Yes, you have, and we'll give Dana, who has arrived, a little bit of time. So I'll give you a little bit of grace so she can have a cup of tea and get herself together.
Okay, right, great. So, I mean, I'll just what we have in these films often are Jews located in nature, in the other films, where they're overwhelmingly presented as urban, urbane, metropolitan, and somehow out of place in nature. So in films like Rio, you have a Jewish bird, a blue macaw, voiced by Jesse Eisenberg, that's how we know he's Jewish, who can't fly. And we have in Madagascar a Jewish lion, voiced by David Schwimmer, that's how we know he's Jewish. And then there's, David Schwimmer voices the giraffe, who's a hypochondriac. Again, all these stereotypes. And Alex the lion's voiced by Ben Stiller, that's how we know he's Jewish, who can't roar. And then they go into nature and they rediscover their kind of natural id, as it were, which has been suppressed by their urban superego, and recover these natural traits of flight and roaring, and but somehow don't like their natural id because it's been so suppressed. And the way they survive in nature is by remaking it over as urban and turning it into something more familiar to their home. So there's a bit of Madagascar where Alex has remade the jungle and it just looks like Central Park, where the zoo is that he's from. And we see that in City Slickers as well. And also, for those of you familiar with Blazing Saddles, the classic Western, in nature, and the idea of the joke of the Jewish cowboy, but at the end, it's revealed the whole thing's a set, very meta, and it shows Jews overcoming nature by turning it into something more recognizably urban. So these are ways these films kind of subtly reinforce these stereotypes. I'll just talk briefly about this one because I think it conjoins quite a little bit of what we've been talking about in the previous two talks, and what I want to say here about stereotypes is this is a great film, probably flew under the radar for many. It's about a Jewish boy on the left here suffering from anti-Semitism in 1960s London until the Jamaican family here moves next door, and as virtue of being able to pass as white, they now become English, even though they're Jewish and were, literally overnight, the day before, subject to anti-Semitism. And the Jamaican family moves next door, and he's an absolute cricket nut, but is useless at it. And slowly, he begins to learn cricket in the back garden. So you can see here, this English back garden has been remade over as a cricket pitch, the entire, full with nets and everything. I think it's very interesting, the background colours here to code this garden, versus, you can't really see this on this the sort of more natural aesthetic here. But I picked this image for so the girl next door and Jonathan become friends, and through that, not only does he learn to become a better cricket player, but he learns to become a better human being, a better a mensch. And unusual for a sporting movie, it's not about winning. In fact, there's most sport movies leads up to the denouement of someone winning, and in fact, at the big cricket match he's expected to attend, he turns his back on it to go hang out with his family. And turns his back on his competitive public school mates, and it's a real example of that privileging of Menschlichkeit over Goyimnachis that I said earlier. But what I find interesting here through the use of cricket is cricket. One could do sessions and sessions on this. Is that archetypal sort of English sport because it's very much rooted in the English countryside of the cricket green, the church, and the pub, and it's very much rooted in this sort of self-conception, probably based in the south of England, the sort of rural garden south, uncorrupted and unpolluted by foreign influences in the imagination. And that's part of the thing of the movie, is it shows the Jewish boy and then the Jamaican family. So the whole family plays cricket here, but really only Jonathan's interested in his family, participating in this English kind of mythos, and rejecting that sense of the kind of rural, overwhelming rural colonial whiteness of it, which would be interesting to connect actually to Marian's talk, because of how cricket, amongst other sports, was used to drive colonialism abroad. But it's another example of how Jewish stereotypes play around with and ultimately conquer these stereotypes of how Jews don't belong in nature. Sports obviously are very connected to that, because of how they largely take place outside, but in the Jewish self-conception, those sports that Jews do well at take place inside, which tends to be boxing, fencing, swimming, and of course chess. Anyway, so as it's 11:30, I will save you having to tell me to be quiet, Karina, and my dogs are fighting. What I will just say is I'll finish off with, so as you can see through a couple of thousand years of history of both how we have been stereotyped on the outside, but how we've in part internalized that, but created our own stereotypes and counter stereotypes. It very much plays around with this nature aesthetic, and suggesting somehow that we don't belong there. And the only way we can belong is by remaking the rural environment into something more recognizably urban. And that plays out loads in, I can find you loads of more examples in popular culture. and it's something that interestingly, I mean, people are challenged. Obviously, the whole Jewish self-conception as well is one thing, but others are challenging in Britain. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Nathan. And you know, that's one thing about the lockdown, the humanization of everybody, where we have pets and children in the background. It adds to the entertainment. Marianne.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you, Nathan. That was absolutely superb. I've never listened to Nathan where I haven't learned so many things. For me, exploring the history of slavery, the way that Jewish historians and Jewish heritage experts deal with the past is of considerable interest to me. And I have visited several Jewish exhibitions, memorials around the world to learn from them about how they interpret their past. And the comment that Nathan just passed about cricket, I would like to mention something in relation to cricket that hopefully we can pick up on afterwards during the Q&A session. But we need now to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Dana Brablek. And thank you so much. I believe she's currently in the Czech Republic, and so has had quite a lot of problems with internet and been able to join us. And thank you to the effort that she has made and been able to join us today. Now, Dana is a postdoctoral research officer at Wizarding Institute at Bangor University and a teaching associate at the University of Cambridge. The Wizard Bangor project that she's involved in currently is entitled Borders, Boundary Mechanisms and Migration. And this work explores how the pervasiveness of structural racism continues to disadvantage the Roma minority in the Czech Republic. But that is not what she's talking about today. Her talk today is on environmental racism and urbanization, the case of indigenous peoples in Latin America. Dana, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm so sorry for missing part of the presentations, but as Marianne said, I'm in the Czech Republic doing fieldwork in Prague. So life has been a bit hectic, so I hope you excuse me. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can please let me know if it works. Yes.
Yep, you can see that clearly.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Amazing. Thank you. So as Marianne said, I titled this presentation Environmental Racism and Urbanization, the case of indigenous peoples in Latin America. And in today's presentation, I will explore indigenous rural to urban migration resulting from a neoliberal economic approach that has jeopardized ancestral indigenous territories, their lands, and is having an impact on indigenous populations and ecosystems more broadly. So not only, of course, affecting indigenous populations, but all of us, basically. And in light of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, I will also address some complexities of indigenous urbanization in the region, in Latin America, placing environmental racism at the center of this discussion. And since emerging as a term in the environmental justice movements of the 1970s and 1980s to address the concerns about Black communities being negatively affected by the US government's social, environmental, political policies, environmental racism has been now widely used to refer to similar situations affecting other racialized communities outside of the US, in the US, indigenous peoples as well, but also outside the US, such as indigenous peoples in Latin America. And as it has been widely discussed in academia, environmental racism refers to the way in which areas, populated primarily by non-whites, and in the case of Latin America, not only non-whites, but also non-mestizo, and no non-mixed race people, but those who identify as indigenous and Black people are burdened with a disproportionate number of environmental hazards, including, toxic waste facilities, garbage dumps, unhealthy working conditions, and other sources of environmental pollution that result in a low quality of life. It also refers to the exclusion of these populations, not non-white populations, from environmental movements, and even the financial discrimination by not providing the necessary funds, the necessary resources to mitigate the effects of disasters, even natural disasters, like hurricanes are not so natural, resulting from floods or wildfires. And what is also relevant in Latin America is how environmental racism has been manifested by discrimination in environmental policy making, and also in terms of law enforcement. But before exploring these issues in more detail, I want to offer a general overview of the situation in Latin America. And I also hope that you excuse my natural bias, but I will be using the Mapuche case in Chile as one of the main examples of indigenous urbanization resulting from environmental racism. I am a sociologist. I study indigenous urbanization, and I have specialized in the case of the Mapuche in Chile. That's why I want to share with you my experience working with this community in relation to environmental racism. And one of the key debates, one of the key or discussions regarding environmental racism is a question of intent. And when it comes to indigenous communities, environmental racism is almost purely the result of policy design on the local, regional, state, or national levels, despite discrimination against these communities being against, of course, international law, international conventions. And let's remember that most Latin American countries have ratified the ILO Convention 169, with the exception of some Central American countries, most notably Panama and El Salvador. And basically, this ILO Convention 169 is the only binding treaty on indigenous peoples. And in its Article 7, and I'm going to read this literally from the convention, it says governments shall take measures in cooperation with peoples concerned to protect and preserve the environment of the territories they inhabit. So basically, this means that the political actions have to be discussed with indigenous peoples themselves prior to being, approved. And we all know that unfortunately this has not been the case in the region. So Latin American indigenous peoples, their prospects, their futures, the presence of futures have changed dramatically since the early decades of the 20th century due to the growing rural to urban migration that has resulted in the majority of cases from a systematic usurpation of indigenous territories from their own states. And the extractive industry has been particularly damaging, harmful in the region, especially affecting indigenous peoples. Their lands that were initially thought to be worthless have turned to be rich in natural resources and open for exploitation, for the development of the whole nation. So with the excuse of developing the whole countries, whole nations, these territories have been constructed as open to be exploited. So since the 1980s, the consolidation of liberal market economies in the region involved, structural transformations in Latin American countries, which targeted the remaining indigenous territories, the remaining indigenous lands, those that survived colonization, those that survived imperialism, as fertile lands for the development of projects such as dams, the forestry and mining industry, highways, roads. So indigenous peoples have been in the way of these profits. And those indigenous leaders who protest against environmental destruction and resulting, pollution and climate change risk being silenced, jailed, or even killed. And whole indigenous communities have been displaced, not only by their poor living conditions in the rural territories, that basically threaten their economies and livelihoods in their rural lands, but also by the violence they face when trying to defend their lands. And just to offer some numbers, and I also wanted to show you some visual materials and photos of this situation. According to a 2020 report by Global Witness, this is a London-based NGO, 212 land environmental defenders were killed in 2019 alone, so only in 1 year. 40% were indigenous people, and 2/3 of the killings took place in Latin America, so only in this region. And at the top of the table was Colombia, with 64 murders due to the failure, especially in implementing the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC, and indigenous peoples, as a result, failing to protect their lands from cocoa and coffee production in order to supply the Europe and Western markets. And only 10% of the perpetrators of these murders were prosecuted. We also have the example of Brazil and Bolsonaro's. I'm pretty sure this has also appeared widely in the media here not here in the Czech Republic, but in the UK too. And Bolsonaro's pressure to expand large-scale mining and agribusinesses in the Amazon. You can see the photo at the top right. And this has resulted in the deforestation of indigenous land, and this has increased by 74% from 2019 to 2019. And of the 24 murders of land defenders in Brazil, 90% occurred in the Amazon, where indigenous, an important proportion of indigenous people still live. And then we have the case of Mexico, in which 18 environmental defenders were killed in 2019, including members of the Tarahumara indigenous people, when they were defending their territory from the illegal deforestation of their ancestral land in the state of Chihuahua. And finally, we also have we're, I think, all familiar with the case of the Honduran activist and indigenous leader Berta Cáceres, who was murdered in 2016 after winning the Goldman Environmental Prize. So she was a renowned, public figure, and she was opposing a dam project in her region, and as a consequence, she was killed. And most of these murders have not only been ignored by the state, but also promoted by government actors. So one of the most evident, clear consequences of this situation is that indigenous peoples have been forced to move to cities in order to find better life prospects. And with the fast development of Latin American cities, new work opportunities are being created for medium and low-skilled jobs. And cities have been transformed into attractive magnets for indigenous peoples, fostering these rural to urban ways of migration to escape from this rural misery, from an economic, but also in terms of violence. And recognizing that cities are filled with a sense of opportunity, these indigenous individuals or indigenous communities will continue to populate urban areas, will continue to populate cities, and their populations will continue to grow. I'm focusing today in Latin America because that's my area of expertise. But of course, this is not the case of Latin America only. This is happening all over the world. For example, 69% of indigenous peoples in North America live in cities. We have the cases of the US, of Canada, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean with 52.2%. And this proportion is increasing every year. And it is impossible or it is very difficult to discuss indigenous life in cities without referring to the controlling processes involved in the historic, multi-sided, multi-purposed, and continuing, colonial and imperial projects of modern nation states. And over hundreds of years, states have been successful in displacing, absorbing, incorporating, assimilating, or destroying indigenous peoples and their territories. And despite numerous alarming predictions, and more importantly, repeated military campaigns and social, social political actions directed against them, against indigenous peoples by their states, sometimes, usually in agreement with, economic interests, private friends, many indigenous peoples have persistently resisted and survived attempts at total extermination in the rural territories and also in cities. And here I want to bring up the case of the Mapuche in Chile, and also reflect on the ways in which states discriminate and destroy indigenous territories and indigenous identities, but in a more subtle way than in the cases of Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and Honduras. And to start with, the pacification of the Araucanía was a very important historical event in Chile. And the Araucanía region is where the ancestral territory of the Mapuche, or the most important proportion of the ancestral territory of the Mapuche, is located. And this was the pacification of the Araucanía. It was an organized military campaign in which the Chilean state imposed a regime of private property and systematically appropriated Mapuche indigenous lands. And as a result, relegated the Mapuche to a system of indigenous reservations in the early 20th century. And slowly, the Chilean agrarian economy was extended beyond the Biobío River, beyond the Biobío border. This was a border that separated the Mapuche, the indigenous, from the non-indigenous, non-Mapuche lands or territory, and occupied Mapuche lands. And circumscribed by a colonizing approach that conceived European immigration as beneficial for progress by industrial development, European colonizers were welcomed to what was regarded as the hostile and sometimes empty territory of southern Chile. And as a result, the Mapuche were relegated to the 5% of their, former territory. And more recently, Latin American governments and the Chilean government, included, reshaped the politics of acknowledgement in relation to indigenous peoples and also their territories by embracing neoliberal multiculturalism. This is a form of recognition, this is a form of governance very prominent in Latin America and the Latin American region as a whole, and Chile is a great example of this. And this is a type of governance that does not challenge the economic and political priorities of the neoliberal state dominant in the region since the 1980s. And very broadly, and I put this on the slide so you can see what I'm basically talking about. Neoliberalism, as you probably already know, refers to a form of social, political, and economic, governance characterized by privatization, economic deregulation, and withdrawal of the state from the public arena, but while also providing at the same time a limited recognition of some cultural rights as compensatory measures in an attempt to neutralize political opposition. And while Pinochet in Chile was the pioneer in the region, this governance has been widely implemented during democratic times as well. And you can see two photos here that I think are very interesting. I can't think of a different adjective. You have Bachelet, former Chilean president, using this kind of a traditional, indigenous kind of flower crown from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, with the flag of indigenous people. And then at the bottom, you have Bolsonaro, the one who is also promoting this destruction of the Amazon with two indigenous leaders, hugging them, smiling, which is kind of typical of this neoliberal multicultural, approach. So to emphasize the integral relationship between these new cultural rights and neoliberal political, economic reforms, the American anthropologist Charles Hale uses the term neoliberal multiculturalism. And this approach has resulted in social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental challenges for indigenous peoples in the region. For example, neoliberalism has entailed an exacerbated exploitation of natural resources, leading to, in many cases, environmental devastation, as governments have favored and privatized, have favored these private, industries in territory, in indigenous territory. And we have the cases of timber and especially mining, the mining industry, and they have favored these kind of, projects over conservation and over people's rights, even the right to live in a safe environment. And for instance, for example, Brazil also offers some good insights into this neoliberal multicultural model. Bolsonaro's Brazil's president proposed a controversial bill allowing mining and agricultural activities and hydroelectric dams on protected indigenous land. But on the other hand, Brazil also approved a law that reserves 50% of places in federal universities for students coming from public schools. Public, I mean, state-owned, not public in the British, way, and low-income families and who are, of African or indigenous descent. And in the case of Chile, we have a strong tendency to favor economic projects such as hydroelectric power plants and road construction, and especially the timber industry that were promoted by the state in Mapuche lands, in Mapuche territory, resulting as a consequence in a deterioration in the quality of life and availability of natural resources for rural Mapuche communities. All these photos are from Chile, so you can see what I'm talking about, what is happening in the Mapuche territory right now. So through a strategy of accumulation by dispossession, these timber forestry companies are actively planting pine and eucalyptus, these trees, in Mapuche territory, promoting territorial dispossession through the replacement of native vegetation. So the most obvious impact is on water resources due to the high water consumption generated by these introduced species compared to the water consumption of native vegetation. And the clearest result of this was already published in a BBC report in 2016, documenting how pine and eucalyptus trees contributed to wildfires by producing, dryness in the soil and in groundwater tables. I think that's the name in English, groundwater tables. And in turn, forest expansion in indigenous territories and environmental degradation have been protected by the state through a series of subsidies created since the time of the military government of Pinochet. So consequently, the main damage produced by these tree plantations has been drought and lasting damage to soils, which cannot be reused for agricultural work. So young Mapuche have been especially drawn to migrate to cities in search of better opportunities for themselves and their families. And as a result, communities face the challenge of losing part of their youth and therefore the main, workforce. And therefore, we have the result of poverty. And I received okay, slide 6, and this is a very striking, powerful photo of Mapuche people in the middle of Santiago. I am not going to analyze in detail the living conditions of indigenous people because I don't have time, and I know that at least in the Czech Republic is almost 1, and I know that you're all busy, but like the Mapuche in cities, I just want to say basically, as very quickly, that indigenous peoples, including the Mapuche in Santiago, have tended to live in the urban peripheries because it's the most affordable areas, usually in Latin American cities. And these areas, the peripheries, are also the most polluted areas with a lack of green spaces, so no parks, also usually with a lack of facilities and services. So while the 2030 agenda, the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, considers among its priorities the well-being of indigenous peoples, so they stated in the UN that the indigenous peoples have to be a priority, both in cities and in their territories of origin, in terms of offering spaces for their voices to be heard. So including indigenous peoples in the decision-making processes of these, bills before they are actually implemented. Also in terms of the elimination of disparities in the enjoyment of the environment, and a general promise of, and they put this, this is basically literally from the agenda. They say to leave no one behind. The reality is that it still feels a long way to actually achieve these targets in the 8 years that separate us from 2030. But far from disappearing as a people, the Mapuche are rearticulating not only their identity, they are still identifying as Mapuche, as indigenous people, but they are also changing, intervening, their surrounding urban environments. So of the Mapuche, currently 35% are congregated in Santiago, which is nowadays a city that concentrates the largest proportion of Mapuche individuals in Chile. And the high proportion of Mapuche population in Santiago has also corresponded with an increasing number of urban organizations, urban indigenous organizations, which currently amounts to 81, 82, which present a space to collectively recreate their identity and the development of cultural activities that foster a sense of belonging to both their territory of origin, but also to the host urban environment. And the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples in the region as well are using these urban organizations to challenge exclusion, to challenge social, political, economic, and also environmental exclusion. And the Mapuche, for example, are increasingly negotiating and gaining the use of urban spaces, reunifying these spaces and transforming them into their own Mapuche places. And in these places, the Mapuche are planting herbs and plants, usually those found in the rural communities of origin, so transforming the appearance of the city. They are also using these spaces to plant vegetables, but contributing to a more sustainable and affordable food consumption. And from a micro political level, the Mapuche are also regaining the right to use the soil, urban soil, for improving their well-being, although not from their territory, but from outside their territory of origin. So ultimately, this also has the potential to counteract the harmful effects of mental health by strengthening, community ties in Santiago and helping them to challenge the increasing desertification that Santiago is experiencing as a result of, global warming and all the photos that I showed you before, which is even more evident the results of climate change in the peripheries of the city where the Mapuche live. And I just want to close this presentation with a quote from one of my Mapuche participants, a Mapuche woman in her 40s. And this is from 2019, just before the pandemic started. And she said, the Mapuche are intrinsically not urban. At least I am always connected to the land, spiritually connected. I just look at a tree and I feel connected to my southern land. I really miss a lot about the south here. Where I live is dirty, noisy. Outside, in the garden, the plants. I entered the organization and started to participate in the herbal medicine workshop and in the allotment. I remembered my grandma immediately. She died. I immediately remembered Nueva Imperial. My family is from El Peral community in the countryside. Thank you.
That was just superb, Dana. And if I might say something now, one of my friend's sons married a young Colombian woman last year, and they were living in the urban, in the woodland, in a wooded area. of Colombia. One of their friends was living with them, and 6 weeks ago she was shot and killed. And my friend's son and his wife have had to flee Colombia because they witnessed this. And when you see your talk, your statistics, they are currently in another country I won't name now, but they are having problems in getting a visa to come to the UK. But it is, yes, the reality of it in hearing your talk and knowing this very personal story that is within the last 6 weeks. It's, yes, everything you say was just so poignant to me. So thank you so much for raising these issues and the work that you are doing. Corinna, we are now going to go into our Q&A session, I believe, which you are chairing.
Right, yes. Are we going into that straight away? Okay. Right. Okay then. So open to the audience, open to the floor. Has anybody got any questions for our fabulous presenters? Have a look in the chat.
Can I raise a point, please? And this is with Nathan in relation to cricket. And if I may make mention to a person in the audience here with us today, and sorry to embarrass you, Jean, but Jean Williams, who is here with us today, she is the great granddaughter of a man called the Reverend William Hughes, who set up the African Institute in Colwyn Bay. And of course, over the 22 years that it was opened, just under 100 students from various parts of Africa were brought over to train as printers, tailors. Many of them went on to become doctors and nurses before they returned to Africa. But while they were here, they set up what is believed to be the first all-black cricket team in Britain. And they played, and the students, after going to the institute, they went on to further studies in Edinburgh, London, various places around Britain. But they always returned to Colwyn Bay during the summer, where they would play cricket against various teams across North Wales. And I think this links very much to Zara's point about inclusivity. We have the differences, but when we can all come together through something that is positive, then that really does help us move forward to address some of the problems that we are experiencing in the world. We were trying, Jean and I were working with some of the Congolese people about a year and a half ago to bring over some street kids from Kinshasa and from Congo to sort of reenact the cricket team, because they play cricket on the streets of Kinshasa all the time. But sadly, of course, COVID put an end to that with lockdown. But we're hoping to revive this project once we're able to travel freely again, when that will be. But cricket, absolutely, the great divide, but also the great way of bringing people together as well.
Brilliant. So does anybody else have any questions for Zara, Marianne, Nathan, or Dana? Oh, Nathan? Oh, I can see a dog in the background who is cute. So has anybody got any questions there for anybody?
Right. Okay, I can answer this one. Elaine has asked how we'll be able to access the recordings, please. Yes, what we are doing, it is currently being recorded via Facebook Live, and it is also being recorded separately as well, where it'll be topped and tailed and what have you, so it'll be running as one smooth video. And our excellent Ethan Lloyd, who has been working behind the scenes here, will be making sure the link is available. We'll be sharing it via our Race Council Cymru social networks, and we'll also be sharing it to Bangor University, and they'll be able to deliver it via our social networks as well. We'll also be sending links to everybody that we know of that we have the emails of that have participated here today. Certainly all our speakers will have a link. So it should be readily available for people to pick up on.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask once more. Does anybody have any questions for our wonderful presenters?
If we don't have questions, I would like, please, because I forgot, after mentioning her, I forgot to bring her in. I would please like to ask Yolanda Banu Viegas to say a few words. She is the lead on Black History for Race Council Cymru in North Wales. Now, Yolanda, if I may share some of your background, please. She was born in Mozambique and grew up in Portugal. Her experiences of coming to the UK haven't always been positive. And through the experiences that she had, she has formulated, after moving to Wrexham, a community called CLPW, which is the organisation to support the Portuguese language speaking people of within the Wrexham area, which includes Brazil, Mozambique, Sao Tome, Angola, the 9 countries of the diaspora. And startlingly, Wrexham, such an interesting place, there are something like 2,000 people from the Portuguese speaking community living in Wrexham. She is the representative for hate crime for Race Council Cymru in North Wales, and she represents the Youth Theatre Wales for encouraging young people from diverse backgrounds to get into theatre. Her list of achievements are just endless. And so if I could ask Yolanda Banu Viegas to say a few words. Thank you. Hang on, Yolanda?
Oh, I'm really sorry. I had a phone call from Clara's GP, and it's always at that time I had to go upstairs. Is it finished already?
Would you like to say a few words? We're just wrapping up now.
Oh, it's just thank you so much for this session. I learned a lot as always. As you know, I didn't study in this country, but in Portugal is about the same. They just focus a little bit on slavery, and that's it. So it is very important that the story of any country should be told as honest as possible. And I believe everybody should listen to this session today. And I'm really grateful that you exist, and thank you so much for everything and the hard work that you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda.
Thank you, Marion. I'm really sorry. It was just the 5 minutes that I missed that I was on a phone.
It's fine. Thank you, Yolanda.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you.
So I'll wrap up then. So thank you very much, Zahara, Zandy, for your really sort of positive historical stories that challenge stereotypical views and challenge narratives of race and demonstrates our diverse national histories and identities, and offer counter narratives as well. I'd also like to thank Dr. Marion Gwynn, apart from being my co-host and organising these things with us, but for giving us a history of Wales's role in Atlantic slavery that went as far back as 400 years, which is quite astonishing, isn't it? But I would also like to argue this is still in a way continuing, this legacy is still continuing. When you look at our footprints of many of the big multinational companies such as Coke and other things around the world. Also, thank you to Professor Nathan Abrams for a really interesting historical analysis of Jewish representation of, in, and as part of nature, and the disassociation of people and environment and nature, and how it's represented and reinforced through popular culture. And finally, to Dana Brabalek, Dana's fascinating and scary account of exploitation and of nature and people with direct impact on certain minority and vulnerable groups, amounting to environmental racism. It is history repeating itself, and more accurately, the continuation of colonialism And so we can see a clear link back to Marion's talk and the links to the other presentations and the more positive stories of using environment and gardening to reclaim space and protest and express identities. These were all really fascinating presentations that help widen the conversation and challenge misconceptions and contribute importantly to knowledge and hopefully to social change. Thank you all, and especially to my co-host, Dr. Marion Gwynn, and to Race Council Cymru for this cooperation and doing this with us. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, do you mind if I just quickly, I've just seen here that Dav Deval has just sent a message saying he would like to make a comment. Dav, would you like to make a comment?
Oh, sorry, I was just saying I did raise my hand. I thought it was a wonderful session, very broad. I think the last lady summarized it really well about listening to everybody's stories. So I was simply the breadth that you touched and the challenge of exploitation. The only thought I had was more just the difficulty of belonging and the identity matter that you raised through all the different presentations. Really, it was just opening that. I'm not sure on the time. Really, it was just. It's such a wealth and breadth of different areas you touch. So that was the only, the problem of belonging, the different kinds of historical damage and pain, and effectively how we, whatever the we might be, Wales nationally or Britain, how those things come and go and the tensions really. That would be where it might be each of the speakers might have a comment of like common identity and particular identity, I suppose, how that works in their own lives really was the kind of question, or which we all have to look at anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to bring you in as you had raised your hand. I'm sorry I missed it. I know I shouldn't do it after the thanks, but I know you always bring in a highly relevant and very interesting point. So thank you, Dav. That was excellent. Thank you, everybody. I'm just following on now from Corinna's comments. Today has just again emphasized just how important these events are. Zara's point at the very beginning is that there are massive differences between us, but if we can concentrate on using those to bring people together, share understanding, then hopefully we can move forward to tackle the real and genuine problems that bring people down. We understand division a lot more when we can talk, and today I think has been superb in helping people understand differences, but also on how we can come together to try to address them, not just through the historical past, but how the present day impacts upon the lives of everyday people. So from me and on behalf of Race Council Cymru, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I really look forward to working with Corinna for our next event next year. Thank you all very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr I chi.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Wonderful. Goodbye.